So on the previous video, we explained all these questions, and the main idea was that answers are the same thing as solutions, are the same thing as x-intercepts, same thing as roots. We also learned about the quadratic formula. Quadratic formula, x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac divided by 2a. And we also went over one example on how to use the quadratic formula. So you have to have this memorized. You have to be able to write the formula over again, but with parentheses instead of the letters. And then you have to identify a, b, and c from your equation, and then plug in those values in their appropriate spot. And then we went through the simplification process. You always have to do the discriminant value first. And when you do that math, well, actually, let's just come down here. We also talked about the discriminant value and how if your discriminant value is positive, you're going to end up with two real answers, which means that your parabola crosses the x-axis at two locations. If your discriminant is 0, that means that your parabola only touches the x-axis at one location. If your discriminant value is negative, that means that inside the square root of your quadratic formula, you're going to end up with imaginary values. So you end up with no real answers. So if your discriminant is positive, you get two answers. If your discriminant is negative, you get no answers. If your discriminant is equal to 0, you only get one real answer. Now, before moving on to today's actual homework, we need to be able to practice simplifying the last step of the quadratic formula. So once again, guys, listen up. When we apply the quadratic formula, after simplifying the discriminant, after simplifying the square root, sometimes we're going to end up with this situation, and a lot of us don't know what to do from here. Now, obviously, we still have a radical, so you can't really get nice whole numbers or nice integers as answers, but we could reduce this fraction. You see, the idea is this. There's really two terms up on top, the negative 6 and the 4 square root of 3. And the square root of 3 is kind of like a variable, right? So if you have an even number, and another even number, you could reduce all three of them. So we could reduce all three of them. So the 6, the 4, and the other 4 you could reduce by what? By 2. So reduce by 2, and you'll get the 3 right there, the 2 right there, and down here a 2. So that answer is going to become negative 3 plus or minus 2 square root of 3 over 2. So this would be the final simplified answer. Now the reason why we're practicing this is because when we apply the quadratic formula, a lot of times you get to here and you won't get full credit. You have to do that final simplification part. Let's take a look at the next one right here, number 2. So, how about you guys try that one and tell me what we'd get? What's in common? 2. But there's something greater. 3. Something greater. 4. Not 4. 6. So, you want to reduce with the greatest value. So, we're going to reduce all by 6. This by 6, that by 6, that by 6. All by 6. Your final answer will be negative 2 plus or minus 1 square root of 3. And you could put over 1, but that would be unnecessary, right? Anything divided by 1 is that same exact value. So let's not write that. You know what else? You don't even have to put the 1 in front of the radical. So that's your actual answer. Negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 3. Let's go to number 3, guys. Stay with me, please. What could I reduce number 3 by? By 2. So, reduce by 2, by 2, by 2. What's our final answer going to be? Negative 4 plus or minus square root of 3 over 2. So this is, and the reason why I'm practicing just this final step is because this is where students make mistakes. They do all the right work, doing the b squared minus 4ac. They even simplify the radical right, but this last step right here, a lot of students mess up on when it comes to reducing. So let's take a look at the actual assignment. This is a worksheet 9.5 WSP. This is all about the quadratic formula and the discriminant. So up here, it says solve each equation using the quadratic formula. And it also says round to the nearest tenth if necessary. I don't even want a decimal number. If you end up with a decimal, just leave it in radical form. Leave it with the square root. Leave it with the plus or minus square root value. The second half is telling us to find the value of the discriminant only, not to do the whole thing, just the discriminant only. So on the first half, it's all about the quadratic formula. Let me do number 1. So let's first write down the quadratic formula. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac divided by 2a. Now, how do we use the formula? You're going to replace the variables with parentheses. So we all, don't be lazy guys, we all need to do that right there. We need to do that right there. And then identify your a value of 1, your b value of 2, and your c value of negative 3, and then plug it in. B goes right here, b goes right here. The a value of 1 goes here, the c value of negative 3 goes there, and the a value of 1 goes right there. Now we always start with the discriminant, the 2 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 3. So let me do 2 squared first. What's 2 squared?
2 squared is
4. And now how about negative 4 times 1?
Negative 4.
And how about negative 4 times negative 3? Positive 12, right? Now all of this happened inside the square root, so let me rewrite it, or let me write it inside the square root with the plus or minus with the negative 2 on the outside. And we might as well do this 2 times 1, that's just 2 on the bottom. So the next step would be to add 4 plus 12, and we're going to get 16. So we're going to end up with negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 16 over 2. And we look now at the radical, the square root of 16. Could I actually do this? Yeah, so what does it become? It becomes 4. So you really have negative 2 plus or minus, we have a 4 instead of the square root of 16, but it's still over 2. Because the square root of 16 is 4. And now from there, you could actually do your two situations, the negative 2 plus 4 divided by 2, and the negative 2 minus 4 divided by 2. So what is negative 2 plus 4? That's 2. And if you divide that by 2, what do you get? You get 1. So one answer is 1. The other one, you get negative 2 minus 4, that's negative 6. Negative 6 divided by 2, that's negative 3. So those are your two answers, x equals 1 and x equals negative 3. Now what does that mean visually on a graph? That your parabola will cross at 1 and 3 on the x-axis. So do we see how we got the nice, beautiful answers using the quadratic formula?
Yeah.
Is that the smartest way to get the answers? It's not the safest way. It's not the best way. It's probably the worst way. I'm just showing you that the quadratic formula always works. Okay? And not only that, on the instructions it says use the quadratic formula. They want you to use it. They want you to practice it. But if you're taking a quiz or a test, the easier thing to do, ladies and gentlemen, would be to recognize that your a value is 1. So maybe you're able to factor it and rewrite it as x, set it equal to 0, and you think what times what is negative 3 that if you add together is positive 2? So what times what is negative 3 that if you add together is positive 2? Positive 3 and a negative 1, correct? So then you could split it and say x plus 3 equals 0 and x minus 1 equals 0. And you're going to get your two answers. What are your two answers?
X equals
So as you could see, you get the same exact answers, but it's a lot faster to factor, split, and solve if it's factorable. Okay? So if you're taking a quiz or a test, first ask yourself, could I factor this? But right here on the worksheet, even if it is factorable, they want you to practice, Isaac, using the quadratic formula. Okay? So right here, number 2. What's the first thing we should do? Write down the formula. So right now, you just asked, can't we factor, split, and solve? Absolutely, we could factor, split, and solve. That's the best method of solving. When the quadratic trinomial that we see here is factorable, you could factor it and then split it and solve it. So might as well do that right here on the side. That would factor to what? What times what is 7? That if I combine together is 8. That would be a 7 times 1, right? 7 times 1 is 7. And if I add them together, it's 8, correct? Yeah? Now, if I were to split them and solve, x plus 7 equals 0, x plus 1 equals 0, we're going to get 2 answers. X equals negative 7, and x equals negative 1. And that's great. We have our answers. We're done. But the instructions don't say find the answers, right? They say solve, but by using the quadratic formula, they want you to practice this guy right here. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac divided by 2a, right? So we need to practice that. And again, you write it down so it'll help you memorize it. And then we're going to rewrite it, but with parentheses instead of the variables. And then after that, we identify our values. The a value is 1. The b value is positive 8. The c value is positive 7. So b is 8. B is 8. A is 1. Put 1 right there and 1 right there. And the c value is 7. Let's work this out. Now, we already have the answers. But right here, what we're doing with this assignment is simply practicing using the quadratic formula. So we're going to end up with a negative 8 plus or minus. And we always start with the discriminant value, what's inside right there. So let's do this. What is 8 squared? That's right. And what is 4 times 1 times 7? What's 4 times 1? 4. What's 4 times 7? 28. So I really have a minus 28. And let me finish this off over 2 times 1. 2 times 1 is 2. So we really have negative 8 plus or minus square root of 64 minus 28 over 2. Now what is 64 minus 28? So we end up with 36 on the inside. So we have negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 36 over 2. Now, what is the square root of 36? 6. So we really have negative 8 plus or minus 6 over 2. Now that really means 2 different situations. The negative 8 plus 6 over 2 and the negative 8 minus 6 over 2. Now negative 8 plus 6, that's negative 2, over 2, that's negative 1 as one of our answers. And the other answer, negative 8 minus 6, that's negative 14 over 2, which means negative 7 is my other answer. Now we already knew that because we factored, split, and solved up here, and we got those same exact answers. But again, the whole purpose of this worksheet is to practice using the quadratic formula. That's what it says up here. They want you to solve by using the quadratic formula. So we want to get really comfortable with this quadratic formula. Now this whole first half of the worksheet is using the quadratic formula. When we look down here, the second half, it's all about that little value, not little value, but that value inside the quadratic formula, b squared minus 4ac. It's all about the discriminant. So they want you to state the value of the discriminant and then determine if you have one solution, determine the number of real solutions of the equation. So if you think about the parabola visually, if it touches it at one point, then that means it has one answer. If it actually crosses through 2 points, then it has 2 answers, right? If it doesn't cross at all, then it has no answers. So let's use that discriminant value to see if we have 1, 2, or no answers. So in number 16, let's all jump to 16, and let's write down the discriminant value, b squared minus 4ac. Okay, now that is within the, might as well write the whole thing here. We're only going to focus in on this red part, b squared minus 4ac. So the a value is 1, the b value is 8, and the c value is 16. And when we do b squared minus 4 times a times c, let's see what we get. b squared, that's 8 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is 16. So I end up with 8 squared, which is 64, and then 4 times 1 is 4, times 16 actually equals 64. So we really have 64 minus 64, which is 0. Now, according to our notes, if the b squared minus 4ac equals 0, how many answers do we have? How many answers do we have? The answer is 0. Okay, maybe I'm asking the wrong questions here. Okay, this 0 is really the b squared minus 4ac on this particular problem, right? Now let's pretend that I were to work out this whole quadratic formula, but I have a 0 in here, right? What is the square root of 0? 0. Now if I add 0, does it change a number? No. If I subtract 0, does it change a number? No. So whatever you have for b and whatever you have for a down here, adding 0 or subtracting 0 is definitely not going to produce two different answers, right? It's not. It's going to produce the same exact answer. So how many answers do we have when our discriminant is 0? How many answers do we have when our discriminant is 0? 1. This is back from our notes, guys. This is what we need to have understood in our mind. This comes out in the final. If b squared minus 4ac, if the discriminant value is greater than 0, in other words, if it's any positive number, then you have two real solutions. It's going to cross the x-axis at two locations. If b squared minus 4ac equals 0, imagine that 0 inside the square root. It doesn't matter if you add 0 or subtract 0. It's not going to produce two different answers. So you're only going to have one real answer. What does that mean visually on the graph? That it'll only touch the x-axis at one point. If b squared minus 4ac is less than 0, that means if it's a negative number, imagine a negative number inside a square root. You can't do that. It'll be imaginary, which means that you don't have any real answers. Okay? So right here on number 16, we got 0 as the discriminant, which means you only have one real answer. So you state your discriminant. Discriminant is 0, which means one real answer. You guys have the answers on the back of your worksheet. Whoops. Okay, so let's do the discriminant on this one. That's a discriminant. Just so you guys don't get confused, it's the inside part of the radical with the plus minus with the minus b out here in the front over 2 times a. But we're only going to focus in on the discriminant, because if we know that this value is negative, what's the square root of a negative number? You can't do it. The square root of negative 9 is 3i. It's imaginary, okay? So if this is negative, then there are no real solutions. If this is positive, then there's two solutions. If this is 0, then there's only one solution, because it doesn't matter if you add 0 or subtract 0, it's going to be the same number. It's not going to produce two different answers. So again, identify a being 1, b being 3, and c being 12. And let's do b squared minus 4 times a times c. So the b value is 3, the a value is 1, the c value is 12. I end up with 9 minus 48. What's 9 minus 48? It's negative 39. Correct? Yes. So my discriminant is negative 39. What does that tell you guys? If I were to do the entire quadratic formula, will I get real answers? No. Why not? Because if you have negative 39 in here, the square root of any negative number is imaginary.